Well, hello, welcome to Reverb, everyone. My name is Calvin Pollock, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host and co-executive producer, Alex Hellberg. How's it going, Alex?
I'm doing all right, Calvin. How are you?
Well, it's a new day in America that's the same day that we've been experiencing for a long time. We're recording this on Monday, June 23rd. On Saturday, the 21st, President Trump announced that the U.S. had bombed Iran. So this is something that longtime listeners of Reverb will know that we did an episode. When was that, Alex? Back in 2018,
Oh, it was
2019?
it was in February of 2020, right after Donald Trump in the previous administration of his Trump 1.0 had just carried out an assassination, a targeted assassination of the IRGC higher up Qasem Soleimani,
Yes.
which at that point was also, a pretty severe escalation of tensions between the United States and Iran that we're now seeing mirrored much, much earlier in this Trump administration.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is something that honestly I've probably been worried about for my entire adult life. I can remember in high school, or I guess late middle school, early high school, when the Iraq war was going on. I mean, I remember the 2004 presidential election. That's how old I am. I remember when Iraq was really the kind of defining issue of that election between Kerry and Bush. And I remember being devastated when Bush was reelected because of what was going on with the US and endless war. So like and even at that time, obviously Iran was on the Bush administration's hit list. And in 2006, there was this big push for war with Iran that thankfully was not able to happen, in part because the Iraq war had destroyed George Bush's approval ratings throughout the country in his presidency. And I guess it's a bummer that Trump is not facing reelection right now, because I genuinely think something like this probably wouldn't have happened, or might not have happened as easily, if he had that kind of political pressure to worry about. Yeah, this is just like something that I've been worried about my entire adult life. And it's a terrifying reality that we're living in, where I think pretty much just before we got on the call, Iran started doing counterstrikes against a U.S. base in Qatar.
Mhm.
And so there's a tit for tat starting directly between the US and Iran. And obviously, this is in the context of a much longer struggle between Iran and Israel that's been going on, for a couple of weeks, but is part of decades of context, right? But it's just, I have no idea where this is going to go. And I'm just so tired of this being all the government does, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you're telling me, pal. It is like you said, it's also something that I've been terrified of for a long time. It's been, I think, because it's been the specter of a war with Iran as a much more, sort of like well established and powerful Middle Eastern country, much more so than, let's say, the kind of, places that we worked to destabilize and invade earlier in the century, Afghanistan, Iraq, which of course had their precursors in the Persian Gulf War and other sort of escalations in the late 20th century. Iran is a lot more of a, I mean, it's loomed large in the sort of foreign policy threats that we've heard politicians make over the course of decades, certainly since I've been alive, and I think even much further back than that, going all the way back to the Iran-Iraq war. Yeah, we're at a point now where it seems that the sort of neoconservative talking point of well, bomb Iran, initiate regime change, this kind of war hawk posture that we've heard about but nobody has seemed to be willing to act upon, has finally been really sort of initiated and acted upon. And yeah, it's in certain ways it bears, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about this as we get into talking about the theoretical and historical context as well as the contemporary rhetoric. It bears so many traces of what you and I think, probably, witnessed from a relatively young age, for me at least, when I was in elementary and middle school, which is, of course, the Iraq War, the way that public consent for that war was drummed up by politicians in the media. We're seeing some vague echoes of that, but it also does feel unique and kind of new in certain kinds of ways as well. And it is to be taken with a lot of gravity. It is a very, very serious and concerning time to be living in for sure.
No, I mean, I'm glad you brought up the neocons because I think a lot of people and probably younger people aren't as familiar with the kind of history of the neoconservative movement and its massive, now largely just institutionalized influence on US foreign policy. Like this was a specific movement of guys like Paul Wolfowitz and Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld who actually got their start, in the Reagan and Ford and, the first George Bush administration, George Bush Sr., with the first Gulf War and earlier kind of aggressive American wars. Yeah, as you said, the Iran-Iraq War, like funneling weapons to Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq War, all kinds of aggressive imperialist foreign policies of the 20th century. But the thing is that the neocons really held kind of unchecked, unchallenged foreign policy power, I would say, until the Obama administration. And this is something
Yeah.
that I did want to say to contextualize this. And we've definitely talked about this on earlier episodes of this show, but it's easy to forget what a massive victory for peace that Iran deal that Obama signed in 2015 was, because that deal, by all accounts, according to all publicly available evidence and even what the intelligence community consensus was, that agreement was working. It was preventing Iran developing nuclear weapons. It was preventing escalation between the US and Iran. It was preventing escalation between Israel and Iran. Like it was genuinely good for the security of the Middle East and of the US and Iran. And Obama had to fight tooth and nail to get that through. But I give him a ton of credit for doing it. Like it's the reason that I would say Obama is one of the best, foreign policy presidents we've ever had, despite all of my critiques of his drone war, his assassination of US citizens using drones. There's a lot that Obama's legacy left us that's really bad. But the Iran deal was a genuine repudiation of the legacy of the neocons. And we seem to be sliding back into a period now where the neocons have total control, at least over Donald Trump in this moment. And part of that, as we'll get into, is the fact that this guy just watches TV all day and the neocons dominate Fox News.
Right.
Um, but a couple other things that I just wanted to mention as context. So the Iran deal had been working. This was a major victory for foreign policy that Obama got through that has now been basically swept under the rug, not just by the Republicans, but also by the Democrats. It baffles me that in in none of the public responses that I've seen from Democrats, Democratic leadership, prominent Democratic politicians to these new strikes, have we seen the Democrats like hold up Obama's legacy as something to defend? I mean, part of that goes back to in the last administration, Biden didn't really run on that legacy or defend it or seek to restore it after Trump had torched it. I mean, Trump tore up the Iran deal in 2018, and he then did those strikes on Soleimani in 2020, like on his way out the door as a lame duck president. And so, like, there's a lot here that I think falls on the Democrats not defending the parts of their legacy that are genuinely anti-war and peace oriented, and that they've kind of just as they always do, as they've been doing since the at least the 90s with Clinton, they've been triangulating to the right on foreign policy. And it's a big reason why we're here, why Trump can just declare war via Truth Social, and that's it. There's nothing we can do about it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We should also say another piece of policy that may or may not come up in the point of our discussions, in addition to what Calvin mentioned, the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, also known as the Iran deal, is also the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, otherwise known
Hmm.
as the NPT, or the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was United Nations policy ratified by a number of different countries, notably not signatories, or notable non signatories include countries that are believed to or known to have nuclear weapons, such as India, Israel, North Korea, Pakistan, and South Sudan. But notably, Iran is kind of one of the notable parties to this deal,
Signatories to it, yes.
signatories to the deal, and has been in compliance with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. There have been, moments where, as with a lot of these treaties, where, questions have been raised about compliance issues most recently. And I think this is part of where a lot of the current tensions may be arising. In November of 2024, the International Atomic Energy Association, the kind of branch organization off of the UN that does enforcement and compliance for this non-proliferation treaty, announced in a report that it was basically, I'm just going to loosely summarize here, that Iran was potentially, there was not unclarity with regard to whether or not Iran was enriching uranium beyond the amount that, or the level that would be needed for basic, energy needs for the country. That enrichment level is at about 3 to 5% enrichment. In the report, they started raising these concerns about Iran having up to 60% enriched uranium. And that data point becomes kind of an important thing that starts getting thrown around in the media. That now, as a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, what is Iran doing with increased levels of 60% enriched uranium? It's important to consider that 90% enriched uranium is the threshold for weapons grade enrichment. But, even still, we get these numbers now thrown around: 60%, 60%. They're well on their way to 90% if they're at 60% now. And so, yeah, there has been a sort of more recent attention that has come, and again, maybe, if I may editorialize a little bit, an excuse perhaps to prevaricate a little bit more about the threat that is posed by Iran's nuclear capabilities, even though, as has been pointed out, we are certainly not the first people to cover this or talk about it. The whole canard in the media and in political discourse about Iran's nuclear weapons program. Iran has never had a nuclear weapons program. It has
Yes.
never officially stated its intentions to develop a nuclear weapon. And all of the reports that have come back from the IAEA and UN has basically, with, again, the few exceptions that I mentioned, said Iran is staying within compliance limits of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It is not developing a nuclear weapon. And that is also what the intelligence community has said as well, right, Calvin?
Yes. Yeah, completely. That's a total consensus of the intelligence community. And Trump's own DNI, Tulsi Gabbard, declared this to Congress, that we have no evidence that Iran is pursuing a nuclear weapon. So, and the only other piece that I want to mention about that specifically, just a cultural piece. I think that, America for many decades, like US kind of publics and particularly media audiences, have been trained to view Middle Eastern countries as fundamentally backward, fundamentally other. This is a whole process of, Orientalism, as Edward Said famously wrote about, where kind of, we view people in these countries, and particularly these countries' leaders, as like fundamentally, dialectically opposite to our own. And one of the data points that gets thrown around, or I guess talking points, to dehumanize and exoticize the Iranian regime, is all this talk about fatwas, right? There's this
Oh,
this
God.
terror of the fatwa. And even, it comes up in comedy. It's in Curb Your Enthusiasm. Like it's like a big, like, Americans love to mock the fatwa and talk about the fatwa. I think, probably well over 90% of Americans do not know a very important fact, which is that Iran's, supreme leader has declared a fatwa against nuclear weapons, right? So
Right.
we take this concept so seriously, but conveniently ignore it when it might, complicate or nuance our understanding of the intentions of this state or the nature of this culture. Like Iran is a very restrained foreign policy actor. It's a lot like China in this way, where, the official government rhetoric is all about sort of, not to imply like cowardness or a lack of like standing up to enemies. I mean, I think particularly in this recent war with Israel, there's been, very militant sort of like self-defense rhetoric coming out of the Iranian government. But in large part, this is a regime that seeks reconciliation and moderation and restraint. And that's a big reason that things have not gotten this bad until now.
Yeah.
Um, Part of that comes down to things like we have a fatwa against nuclear weapons. It's not a goal. We're signatories to the NPT. We're not going to abandon international commitments. And I think, another point to raise related to this is just that we conveniently ignore religion when it's not convenient to talk about. So the fact that the United States is currently being led by a president who to a significant degree was empowered by far right fanatical evangelical Christians. So that Christianity at the core of his coalition, his power base gets abstracted out. We only talk about religion in regards to countries like Iran. We also don't talk about, the fanatical Jewish supremacism of a state like the Israeli state, right? And so we essentialize our enemies while, we also essentialize ourselves
Yeah.
by sort of highlighting the rational and ignoring the irrational when it's convenient to do so.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. It's a really important thing to keep in mind here as well. As you're probably hearing, we're talking about propaganda tropes in great detail, I think today. And one of them that you will see kind of recurring here is, or at least ramping up, that was certainly something that was heard a lot in the wake of the September 11th attacks. As part of those attacks, Islamophobia, Orientalist sort of xenophobia was militarized as a propaganda strategy to drum up support for war, right? This fear of otherness. Now you're starting to hear it in the talk of like, what are, I don't know, for whatever reason, not only fatwa, but also the mullahs are
The
something that
mullahs,
the
yeah.
mullahs are something that I hear coming up in a lot of the reporting on this, which literally just means a mosque leader or a clergy person in the Islamic faith. It is also, by the way, a term that is used by Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews across different traditions of Judaism as well. So I mean, again, but it's one of
Well, and
those
it's like
terms that can be.
imagine if that were flipped. Like imagine if Iranian audiences were constantly being propagandized about, the ministers of America, the ministers and pastors and
The
priests.
archbishops.
Yeah,
Ooh, yeah,
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 ooh,
right.
that's
Yeah.
simply not done because our religion gets ignored. And just another example of this that comes up constantly and that I think we're going to see in some of these examples we're going to look at is the capital R regime. Like Iran doesn't
Oh,
have a
yes.
government, it has a regime.
That's right.
And we must always capitalize that word to make it scarier.
Yeah.
And I guess, you know, you do sometimes see US liberals referring to the Trump regime, capital R, which I
Hmm.
like. It's kind of a
Yeah.
cute way
But
to
it, but
like but the
oh,
reason they're doing that is because of this whole discourse, like this historical discourse, which has primarily been turned against foreign enemies and foreign
That's
others,
right.
right?
And it is, I think, in many ways to imply that, like, oh, well, it's because the Trump administration is backwards and
Yeah.
anti-civilizational in the same way. So, yeah, I mean, I also recognize, I don't think that's probably top of mind for everybody who's using it, but I do think that there is a slight twinge of this kind of like Orientalist or sort of Western centric bent when people do use that to try and say that Donald Trump is an aberration rather than, as we're going to, I think, examine here, a continuation of a lot
Yep.
of libidinal political energies that have been part of American political life for a very long time.
Yeah, and I mean the we saw all of that, those same orientalizing tropes towards Trump in the Russiagate discourse, which
Yes.
we have some episodes about that we'll link to in the show notes. But Alex, I wanted to ask you, so like in your, I guess, experience of this crisis so far, what have been some of the presidential rhetoric artifacts that have stood out to you, presidential or how the administration is talking about this? What are some examples we can look at that can kind of help us understand how Trump is trying to propagandize us into accepting this war?
Yeah. So to begin here, I think it's important to contextualize what we are, the current sort of conflagration that we're talking about here, at least at the point of this recording. We can call it, I think, accurately enough, a conflagration.
Yeah.
Really starts in around October of 2024. This was the one of the earlier times within the current time span where Israel specifically launched strikes on Iran, in addition to Lebanon, Syria, a bunch of other places that they were also striking as part of their sort of expanding territorial war across other parts of the Middle East. Iran was kind of being held up as this kind of fulcrum of all those different countries that provided material support to Hamas and Hezbollah and some of the other organizations and political parties that are leading those countries and those nations. But then just recently on June 13th of 2025, there was another round of Israeli strikes on Iran that were taken as what they claim to be preemptive measures against Iranian attacks on Israel. Again, based on intelligence that was not made public or, may not exist at all, may have been used, as many are saying, to kind of draw the United States into further, more direct confrontation with the Israeli war in the Middle East currently. And so, right around 4 days after the strikes from Israel to Iran began, Donald Trump made a post on Truth Social. This is June 17th, 2025, that made, it was a cause for concern among some people, I think, understandably. He truths on Truth Social. We know exactly where the so-called, quote, supreme leader is hiding. He is an easy target, but is safe there. We are not going to take him out, parentheses, kill, exclamation mark, end parentheses, at least not for now. We don't want missiles shot at civilians or American soldiers. Our patience is wearing thin. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Which is as disorienting as it is concerning that, you're ending a truth or a post on a social media site with something that sounds like you are cold emailing customer service for some company that thank you for your attention to the matter of getting my radiator fixed on my car or whatever, thank you for your attention to the matter of getting my refund processed. He's talking about this in the same way when he is essentially making a veiled threat against Ayatollah Khomeini.
Not very veiled at
Not
all,
very
right?
veiled at
Kill,
all.
putting kill in
Yes.
in parentheses.
Yeah, and saying we are not going to take him out, parentheses, kill, at least not for now, right?
Right.
But there's this sort of looming specter that, we have it within our power. If we wanted to, we could do it. Again, this is kind of echoing the strikes from the earlier days from Israel, specifically targeted members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, the main sort of military faction of the Iranian government. And so, Trump is kind of responding to this idea that the leadership is being targeted. Israel went after the military brass, but, if we wanted to, we've got the Ayatollah in our crosshairs and, we could pull the trigger and parentheses kill at any time we wanted to. So already that was a little bit concerning. There were
Yeah.
already, as we've discussed on this show, as critical consumers of media will know, the Israeli military capacity does not really exist without the support of the United States and Germany and other sort of like international partners that's the UK, yes, other countries in Europe that send weapons or money or supplies or other things to their military. So there was already a little bit of concern about the degree to which this round of political assassinations was being upheld by the United States, if it was being done with, U.S. tax dollars and support,
Hmm.
material or rhetorical. And then there was this little slip that came out when Senator Ted Cruz appeared on Tucker Carlson's show on X, the Everything app. And I think if we can, I want to set it up so that we can play just a little bit of audio from
Do it.
that, because the audio that was leaked on June 17th, 2025, so this was that very same day that Trump made that truth, was also, I
Mhm.
think, equally concerning to people.
You don't know anything about the country. You're the one who claims they're not trying to murder Donald Trump.
No,
You're the
I'm
one
not saying that.
who can't figure out
I'm
if it was a
saying
good
you
idea
don't
to kill
believe
General Soleimani, and you
don't
said it was bad.
believe they're trying to murder Trump.
Yes, I do.
Because you're not calling for military strikes against them in retaliation. And if you really
we're
believe that,
carrying out military strikes today.
you said Israel was.
Right, with our help. I said we. Israel is leading them, but we're supporting them.
Well, you're breaking news here, because the U.S. government last night denied, the National Security Council spokesman Alex Pfeiffer denied on behalf of Trump that we were acting on Israel's behalf in any offensive
No,
capacity.
we're not
at all.
bombing them. Israel's bombing them.
You just said we were.
We are supporting
This is
Israel.
high stakes. You're a senator. If you're saying the United States government is at war with Iran right now, people are listening.
So, yeah, a little chilling there. I think
Yeah.
you're hearing Ted Cruz more or less, whether through a slip of the tongue or whatever, more or less admit that the United States is materially supporting Israel's bombing campaign against Iran, and perhaps presaging some events that were going to occur several days later. I don't know. What was your reaction to that
Yeah.
upon first seeing it, Calvin?
No, I mean, it really, yeah, it scared the shit out of me, because what we're talking about is this issue of the use of the term we. So he didn't just imply that we were materially supporting it. He, with his Freudian slip, and I do intentionally use the term Freudian slip, he said that we were doing it, not that we were materially supporting it. We are striking them. We are attacking them. And I want to also point out that in that truth post that we read, you can see very clearly Trump, I believe, driven by the neocons in his ear. But I think Trump himself is to a large extent a neocon. He's been a conservative, since the Obama administration, and conservatives are neoconservative. But you can hear him attempting to engineer a pretext for the war. This is the other thing to remember about the neocons and the war in Iraq. The neocons had, through this group called the Project for a New American Century, PNAC, they had drawn up a list of targets for regime change well before 9/11 that included Iraq and included Iran, right? And so 9/11, and there's a lot of reporting on this, retrospective, history work that's been done. 9/11 was extremely convenient for the neocons to serve as a pretext for a broader military campaign in the Middle East. And that is exactly what's happening with Trump and Cruz in these clips. For Cruz, one of the major pretexts is this idea that Iran is trying to assassinate Donald Trump. And that may or may not be the case, but I refuse to believe it in the absence of extremely detailed documented evidence, because stuff like that is just thrown around by leaders to justify war and justify like scaring populations. So I'm just going to assume that that's a lie. And Trump as well in his post is saying, don't go for our civilians or our service members, or we might have to take out the supreme leader. By the way, that is clearly a threat on the life of the leader of this country too. So that's another way in which, the justification for war never works both ways, where somehow Iran has no casus, despite the fact that we're like openly threatening their leaders with assassination. And it's not an empty threat. Israel, as you said, in October 2024, took out the entire Hezbollah leadership, did these attacks, which human rights experts have, correctly labeled terroristic attacks on pagers in Lebanon, to take out the entire Hezbollah leadership. And then Israel, early last week, did targeted assassinations on many of the leaders of Iran. Trump in 2020 took out basically the equivalent of the Secretary of Defense of Iran. So these are not empty threats. And yet, Cruz is trying to engineer a pretext for a war against Iran based on totally made up claims that they're trying to assassinate Trump, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, to paraphrase the Iranian cleric in the wake of Soleimani's assassination in 2020, basically, there would be no compensatory,
no equivalent
hero to strike, because in their words, quote, America has only fictional heroes like SpongeBob SquarePants and Spider-Man. So which is just absolutely ethered, but also really does show, but also does really show the extent of like Iranian restraint here. And when you really do, like, again, I don't mean to come off totally like saying unequivocally that, like, the Islamic Republic of Iran is a unequivocal good. All countries, all nations have their blemishes and have things that are worthy of praise and blame. But I mean, when you actually look at it pound for pound, the amount of times that they have been attacked and transgressed against and have done nothing in response, or have had like a much more diplomatic response to it, you just come off seeing like who's the actual sane power here. When we're measuring it up here, I mean, the country that looks like it is more interested in peace and stability is Iran at all of these turns, 100%.
Right. And we can praise the restraint of the Iranian regime on foreign policy without saying anything about their domestic policy, because frankly, it's not my business. I am not Iranian. I have no say in what goes on in the internal politics of Iran. I'm sure there are problems there. It's a capitalist country just like mine is. There's massive inequality. There's rights violations just like we have, right?
Yep.
And those are what we should be sorting out instead of bombing foreign leaders. But I did want to come back to this question of the we, right?
Yeah.
Because I think this slippage between the we of the United States and the we of Israel and Israeli foreign policy, that it's equivalent, that it's totally coterminous with our foreign policy, is a massive problem in U.S. political rhetoric. This is something that, it can't be overstated the extent to which it makes us less safe. It makes us more, militarily extended and involved and more imperialistic. And it just like simply doesn't have to be that way. These don't have to be considered American problems, but they are, because the U.S. empire is to a large extent dependent on Israeli power and Israeli intelligence, kind of like the strategic foothold of the Israeli state as a launching base for, broader projections of U.S. military power throughout the region. And so, like, to a very large extent, it is one we, strategically, militarily.
Yeah.
But when that becomes a sort of truism of political rhetoric domestically here in the United States, I think it completely occludes like all of the perverse incentives built into that relationship. And that's not something that we have to accept. Like, that has nothing to do with me. I'm not in the military. I don't care about US like military dominance in the Middle East. It does nothing for me. As we've been saying, part of what's so like scary and depressing and sad about what's going on right now is that, like, I can count on one hand the number of things my government has ever done for me, but it would take like two hands and my feet to count all of the countries that my government has bombed.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the real problem.
Yeah, just in our lifetimes alone, even too. It's crazy to think about that. And just more to the point of what you're saying about the we, about the degree to which the US and Israel both see their sort of destiny as coterminal with one another is, the images that came out of, from Tel Aviv in the wake of the US bombing against the Iranian nuclear sites. They had these banners that were going across the highway
Yes.
in Tel Aviv that said, "Thank you, Mr. President," and had a picture of President Trump on them. By the way, just for clarification, Israel does have a president. It's Isaac Herzog. So to
Yep.
say, "Thank you, Mr. President," in Israel, and then having a picture of Donald Trump next to, again, the visual rhetoric of that is just, kind of speaks for itself, but it also, I think, bears mentioning that is.
Yeah, I think we might have to use that as the episode thumbnail for this episode,
Yes,
because
I think so.
that image is just so disturbing.
Yes.
It renders sort of like fascist authoritarian dystopian fiction like moot. I mean, this is just something that's really happening that you can't sort of like write into fiction any better. It's just a perfect representation of the loss of democratic legitimacy. I mean, and I like, I'm gonna self-edit there because when you say loss of legitimacy, it assumes that we ever really had it, and I don't know that we did, right?
Yeah.
But there's something extremely disturbing about this kind of like empty highway that, by the way, is empty because Israelis are sheltering from a war a war of choice that their government started that it didn't need
Yes.
to start.
That's
And I'll say that I know people who have family members who are sheltering from this war, and they're pissed. Like, they are pissed at their government for starting this war.
Yeah.
And so it's not good for Israelis either. And I think like it's important to not lose sight of that either, that like there are real victims on all sides of this. And yeah, I mean, the US, I'm sure, is not far away from experiencing blowback from this as well.
Yeah, no, and that's, again, yeah, we want to talk about, our own concern here, but yes, yeah, there are victims. I mean, no one wins, as they say with war. I think Bart Simpson said it best.
War is neither glamorous nor fun. There are no winners, only losers. There are no good wars, with the following exceptions: the American Revolution, World War II, and the Star Wars trilogy.
There are no winners. It's not fun. There are only losers, right?
That's right.
So anyway, yeah, we now come to the sort of central artifact of the presidential rhetoric on the strike. So this fast forwarding now to the evening of Saturday, June 21st, the early morning hours of June 22nd in Iran, Donald Trump again posts to Truth Social, quote, "We have completed our very successful attack on the 3 nuclear sites in Iran, including Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. All planes are now outside of Iran airspace. A full payload of, all caps, bombs was dropped on the primary site, Fordow. All planes are safely on their way home. Congratulations to our great American warriors. There is not another military in the world that could have done this. All caps. Now is the time for peace. Thank you for your attention to this matter."
Again, thank you for your attention to this matter. I mean, that's
going
that
on
is
with that.
no pun intended. That's striking.
Yes.
That this has become like the sign off for multiple examples of war propaganda coming out of this president. Like, why do you think he feels the need to end these with this bizarre boilerplate statement of "thank you for your attention to this matter"?
I mean, if we do want to get into some of the sort of psychoanalysis here of the who is the American subject who is being addressed and interpolated by Trump's discourse, it is we, the American people, who are not necessarily, in the traditional way that we think of, an elected representative being someone who works for us, but rather somebody who is merely communicated to, someone who is a passive recipient of
You know what
the
it reminds me
discourse.
of? You know what
Yeah.
it reminds me of is, a lot of us are tenants, probably
Yeah.
listeners.
Oh,
a lot of us on this call, a lot of the hosts of this podcast are tenants. And if you've ever gotten like an email from your property management company or your landlord that's like, you know, we have a little too much loud music coming from the windows of the units on the east side of the complex. Please observe quiet hours from blah, blah, blah to blah, blah, blah. Thank you for your attention to this matter. I mean, it
That's
really
right.
reminds me of a kind of administrative announcement that you receive from some kind of institution that has power over you, but that you have
Yes.
very little power to control yourself, right?
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. That's exactly what it is. No, you're you kind of nailed it there. It is Donald Trump is everybody's landlord, which is not a position that you want to say that you're in with regard to anybody. A landlord is
Right.
not
Well,
something
and
that any of us should want to be.
particularly given his history with, tenants launching successful, lawsuits against him for racist treatment.
Ooh. Oh, you're
So
so
like, yeah,
right.
it's all kind of coming full circle here. But I actually, I'm glad that you mentioned too the kind of libidinal psychoanalytic aspect to this, because that's another thing that I wanted to touch on here, which is that there is something, I mean, even it comes through in the way he writes these posts. There's something very libidinal about all US war policy, all kind of like militaristic policy that really comes through. I mean, even in the line, a full payload of bombs was dropped on the primary site. And later he says, congratulations to our great American warriors, capital A, capital W. There's an element of like Trump, it feels like Trump did this to kind of resolve or explore or express a libidinal need to deliver a payload, like to observe the great American warriors doing what they're doing, not for peace or any kind of like larger strategic objective, but simply to explore this psychoanalytic urge that he
Yes.
has deep inside of him, and that a lot of American men have. It's not
Yes.
unique to Trump. This is something that goes way back. And I did want to mention here, so a classic work of presidential rhetorical scholarship from the late 1980s is Jeffrey Toulis's The Rhetorical Presidency. And one of
Yes.
the things that Toulis talks about is how really like the version of presidential rhetoric and specifically presidential war rhetoric that we have in modern America is inherited from the rhetoric of Woodrow Wilson during World War One. And World War One was really kind of like the moment when America ascended as a global empire, as a power that could significantly alter and influence world events. And another occasional reference on this show is that we've talked about the work of the documentary filmmaker Adam Curtis. He has a classic series that I recently rewatched called The Century of the Self. One of the things that I unearthed like from watching that series again, it's from 2002, The Century of the Self, is that Edward Bernays, who was Sigmund Freud's nephew, who is largely credited with inventing the discipline of public relations, really corporate communications, corporate PR. He was an advisor to Wilson during World War One, advising the public war rhetoric of the government at that time. And Bernays is basically responsible for all of the corporate rhetoric that we take for granted today. And he built his advice to Wilson on psychoanalytic theory, on his uncle Sigmund Freud's understanding of the id, the ego, and like how to kind of like speak to people's ids through public messaging and public rhetoric. And, I find it very fascinating that Toulis in the rhetorical presidency traces so much of the kind of propagandistic function of presidential rhetoric to Wilson and World War One. And that's really, I think, the legacy that Trump is continuing. Of course, technology and various, political developments since then have dramatically reshaped how this functions. We're even seeing, through these bizarre platforms like Truth Social, like how different it is than obviously it was during World War One. But the fundamental function is the same, where the president is this figure of kind of like giving voice to the id of the American public to kind of resolve these deep-seated psychological yearnings through some kind of spectacular state action. And I think that really is what Trump is trying to do with this war in Iran. Now, the difference now is that politics is so fragmented. His credibility and his approval is so kind of like flawed and unstable compared to administrations of, you know, from earlier eras that had like much more kind of unified public support behind things like foreign policy. But it's fundamentally the same, where it is kind of this function of public presidential rhetoric. So Toulis points out that, going back to Wilson, quote, for Wilson, the very heart of representative government was the principle of publicity. The informing function of Congress should be preferred even to its legislative function. So what Toulis is saying there is that, you know, Wilson innovated this idea that the president should more or less decide what the policy is and then inform the public, rather than the other way around of getting public assent and then kind of enacting the will of the public. This sort of performative public rhetoric goes back to Wilson. And again, that's what we're seeing in these posts from Trump.
Yeah, no, and it's really kind of interesting to think about that Wilson-Bernays connection in terms of also, you know, Wilson being the one who kind of revolutionized this view of the communicational transaction between president and public being unidirectional. The president conveys something to the public, but specifically something that aligns with the kind of like libidinal impulses, because, you know, Bernays was actually, I mean, if you read his writing, he's quite cynical about human beings and the kinds of things that drive our unconscious desires, the kinds of ways that those can be manipulated, and is very, you know, very frank about the ways that people who have the ability should manipulate the will of the public. In Bernays' propaganda, he talks about this kind of being for their own good, right? That the sort of mass public should be told what to think and what to do, but also, again, pioneered the strategies that were about sort of generating that assent by, you know, putting a message in line with libidinal impulses, with the things that are going to communicate directly to your lizard brain and make you feel those sort of impulses that, you know, you may not feel comfortable expressing on your own, but now you have a channel through somebody who, you know, who is, you know, in every sort of spectacular vision that you get through the media, more powerful, larger than life, who is able to take that desire that you have suppressed and, you know, turn it into geopolitical strategy, right? Or to enact it on a global scale. You know, it's something that's certainly a little bit unique to, I think, the sort of American way of governing and being governed, where we talked a little bit about this on our last episode, the No War with Iran episode from 2020, about how U.S. foreign policy ends up being something that is kind of like a channel for our libidinal desires, but something that we never have to experience the ramifications or the consequences of. It's a way of tapping into those, you know, electrifying lizard brain emotions without actually having to feel or fear even consequences from what might come of the actualizing of those desires. And so, you know, as a result, I think it's important for us to keep that in mind here as well, that, you know, where with Wilson, we were talking about the creation of this kind of this heroic narrative of the US coming out of World War I, and then, of course, reinforced after World War II, where, you know, we are now a superpower. We are a global hegemon. We sit atop the sort of, you know, the power of the world. And now we're at this point where it's been so, I don't know, there's something that's interesting about fast forwarding and looking at our current moment with that as the background context, because it just feels like that assumption is so taken for granted that you can, I mean, we've talked about this. This has been a recurring theme in a lot of episodes over the past several years. Why does official rhetoric just sound so bad and so lazy and so, you know,
Thank
trite
you for your
and
attention
stupid?
to this matter.
Yes, because
Woodrow Wilson would never have said, "Thank you for your attention to this matter," right?
right. And I think it's largely because of the internalization of that, that standing of the US as being, the sort of like the world hero, the world
The
police.
world's landlord.
Yeah, the world. Oh God. Yeah, US imperialism brought to you by BlackRock.
Yep.
That's gonna start buying all the beachfront property in Gaza.
Yep.
So
No, I mean, I think what you're pointing out is really important in the sense that it looks so different now. As you're saying, it's been internalized, but I also think there's a widespread public cynicism about it that so it just doesn't hit as well. I mean, really, since Vietnam, we're dealing with the Vietnam. People talk about it. The Vietnam syndrome or the Vietnam hangover, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, the entire American public saw that the U.S. like can't do these imperial wars and actually succeed. They're impossible to like gain full victory over, and really, it's just they're just shooting fests to just kill civilians. But there was a kind of pivot, I think, thanks to this mediatized figure of the Islamic or Arab other in the 90s, beginning with the Gulf War and taking us to today, where 9/11 and other sort of trends in American politics have kind of re-enlivened at least the fear of the foreign other, even if we don't have, and I believe that fear of the foreign other is very libidinal, but even if we don't have the same investment in the great American hero that we used to have, I think people are much more cynical about that than they are cynical enough about like this foreign other trope. I think people are still unfortunately swayed by that.
Yeah. And that's actually, I mean, you've convinced me now, Calvin. I do think that actually the landlord, it's the world's landlord rather than the world's hero or savior is the proper metaphor to use here, because it is more about this sort of like management of, as long as the egg prices stay low enough, as long as oil prices stay low enough, which it gets into something that's coming to the fore now. Just today, we have Donald Trump. Let me pull up the post so that I can quote it directly here. So this is what Trump posted on Truth Social today, June 23rd, 2025. This is almost entirely in all caps. Everyone, keep oil prices down. I'm watching. You're playing right into the hands of the enemy. Don't do it. And then later he adds, drill, baby, drill. And I mean now. So.
And that reminds me, it's fascinating the extent to which Trump has just become John McCain.
Yes.
After despising John McCain and trying to like tarnish his legacy in various kinds of like public statements, McCain was the one who on the floor of the Congress, did this horrific, what was it? It was a Beach Boys song parody.
Yeah.
Bomb, Iran.
Yes, we'll insert that clip here.
It's well documented that we have, for quite a long time now, known where the real problem is in the Middle East. And in fact, the president adequately described it as the axis of evil. I guess my question is, how many times do we have to prove that these people are blowing up people now? Never mind if they get a nuclear weapon. When do we send them an airmail message to Tehran? That old Beach Boys song, Bomb Iran? Anyway,
just like some of the most vile warmongering rhetoric we've ever heard. And now Trump is recycling that, as well as drill baby drill, I believe was a McCain,
that was a McCainism.
Like, campaign slogan in 2008 against Obama.
Yep.
So yeah, it's just, I mean, for anyone within Trump's support base who thought that he was, this kind of like based opponent of the neocons, you fell for it again. Like, I'm sorry to keep invoking the fell for it again award, but you win it. And that includes, people who I used to respect, like Glenn Greenwald and others. who just fell for this hook, line, and sinker, thinking that somehow Trump is a counter to the core structural power of the neocons, and particularly the evangelical Christian base that is incredibly warmongering,
Right.
and as we've talked about before, like largely wants all the Jews to move to Israel so that the apocalypse can happen, right?
Yes. Yeah, the millenarian Christian side of this can also not be overlooked, but that's even perhaps a topic for another episode, because
Absolutely.
that's a big
Absolutely.
one.
But the point is that, yeah, Trump has kind of become John McCain before our eyes in the last 5 days. It's really crazy.
No, absolutely. So we alluded a little earlier in our conversation to this notion of, the intelligence upon which this decision to strike Iran, again, unprompted striking Iran, was based. And a lot of it comes down to this issue of, again, it's a direct echo resonance of the rhetoric of the original war on terror, the 2003 war in Iraq, to get very specific here, that was motivated by claims of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq that were being developed, held, and were considered a threat to use by Saddam Hussein. So
which in fact did not exist.
Which did in fact, yes, it bears mentioning, did not exist. It was a huge kind of story that was all this like stovepiped so-called intelligence that was leaked to the media. Colin Powell used all these different rhetorical strategies. For more, you can read our friend and advisor's John Otto's book on the subject of Colin Powell's speech at the UN, where he more or less kind of fabricated the evidence that was used as justification for the U.S. invading Iraq.
And then wait, let me just mention here, that controversy and the way in which Powell's rhetoric was repackaged by the media is a crucial part of it, where it was not simply a matter of the unitary executive or even the rhetorical presidency. It was this distributed, mediated propaganda that really got the drums of war beating. And I think a similar thing is happening right now, as we'll see in this clip.
Yes, absolutely. So this is a clip of Margaret Brennan of Face the Nation speaking with Marco Rubio, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, again on June 22nd, 2025. And here's what they had to say.
Are you saying there that the United States did not see intelligence that the Supreme Leader had ordered weaponization?
That's irrelevant. I think that question being asked in the media, that's an irrelevant question.
No,
they have
but that is the key point in U.S. intelligence assessments. You know that.
No, it's not.
Yes, it was.
No, it's
that
not.
The political decision had not been made.
I know that better than you know that, and I know that that's not the case.
But I'm asking you whether the order was given.
And the people who say that, it doesn't matter if the order was given. They have everything they need to build nuclear weapons. Why would you bury things in a mountain, 300 feet under the ground?
Right.
Why would you bury why do they have 60% enriched uranium? You don't need 60% enriched uranium. The only countries in the world that have uranium at 60% are countries that have nuclear weapons, because they can quickly make it 90. They have all the elements. They have. Why do they have a space program? Is Iran going to go to the moon? No, they're trying to build an ICBM.
No, but
so
that's a question. That's a question of intent, and in the intelligence assessment that it was that Iran wanted to be a threshold state and use this leverage. I'm talking about the public March assessment, and that's why I was asking you if you know something more from March.
But that's also an inaccurate representation of it. That's an accurate representation of it. That's not how intelligence is read. That's not how intelligence is used. Here's what the whole world knows. Now, forget about intelligence. What the IAEA knows. They are enriching uranium well beyond anything you need for a civil nuclear program. So why would you enrich uranium at 60%?
Right.
If you don't intend to one day use it to take it to 90 and build a weapon?
Right.
Why are you developing ICBMs? Why do you have 8,000 short-range missiles and 2,000 to 3,000 long mid-range missiles that you continue to develop? Why do you do all these things? They have everything they need for a nuclear weapon. They have the delivery mechanisms, they have the enrichment capability, they have the highly enriched uranium that is stored.
Yes.
That's all we need to see.
Right.
That's all we need to see.
Yeah. So,
except the actual literal presence of weapons.
yeah, absolutely. So this is fascinating, this kind of slippage that we're seeing where, on the one hand, Rubio is challenging the authority of this interviewer on the intelligence. So saying basically like, there's a lot, you notice like pragmatically in that conversation, there's a lot of authority being exerted by Rubio to say, I know the intelligence, you don't know the intelligence. But
Yes.
then he slips multiple times by saying, forget the intelligence.
The intelligence doesn't matter. Yeah,
the
yeah.
intelligence doesn't matter. And in that, in that move, we can see really strong historical echoes of stuff that's happened in the past. So I wanted to bring in this article that I read for my PhD exams back in the day, and I revisited it this weekend as all of this was happening because it's incredibly informative about what's going on here. So this is by Gordon Mitchell from 2006, Team B Intelligence Coups. And so what Mitchell describes is that basically within the intelligence community, within the US intelligence community, there's this process of competitive analysis that goes on. And it's actually like, for all my critiques of the intelligence community, you can read my articles about NSA surveillance. Like, intelligence has way too much power and is way too secretive about how it uses its power and what its capabilities are, particularly for surveillance. But having said that, there is, through this competitive intelligence analysis process, there's actually a kind of like academic community within the intelligence community that studies problems and debates their solutions in ways that I actually think are deliberative and productive, because what they do is, like, given a certain topic or threat, they analyze the data they have and they present different conclusions, and different kind of like members of the intelligence community debate the strength of the different conclusions and their relationships to the evidence. And I'm glad that that's done rather than a different model in which, like, an extremely hierarchical decision-making process would happen where there's no kind of debate about what's going on. So I think that's good. But what Mitchell traces in this article is that starting in the late 70s in the Ford administration, which, for those who aren't familiar with the history, Ford was the president who took over after Nixon resigned. This was an extremely hawkish, largely like kind of the precursor to the neocon kind of movement and conservatism. Very hawkish administration, let all of the criminals of the Nixon administration off the hook, like fully gave them pardons for their corruption. And Ford, in his administration, began this process of Team B. So he empowered a Team B within intelligence analysis that basically corrupted this competitive process to make it so that, with a pre-existing conclusion of the Soviets are militaristic, they're outpacing our weapons development, they are seeking to invade all of these countries and take over the world, that pre-existing conclusion was presented, and then evidence was found to justify it. So this was in 1975, and then it basically shaped the foreign policy of the 1980s under Reagan, where the US invested way more in nukes and weapons than we had to that point. And it created this arms race with the Soviets that really pushed us to the brink of war multiple times in the 80s, and was an incredibly dangerous situation, and spilled over into the 90s with the Gulf War and all of the kind of endless war that we've seen since. But it culminated in kind of its most dramatic example in 2003 in the push to the Iraq War. And this is really kind of the heart of Mitchell's article. He talks about how basically Cheney empowered this kind of secret cell within the intelligence community to cook up evidence of WMDs that people like Colin Powell could use at the UN, and then the media could take up and kind of, push this terrifying threat of Saddam Hussein. And I just want to quote one part of the article. Mitchell writes, quote, paraphrasing, the case of the Iraq War, quote, shows how connectivity ripens bureaucratic conditions for Team B intelligence coups. Policymakers and their aides can informally access secure intelligence community databases and use powerful data mining techniques to cherry pick intelligence. They can then bolster the persuasive power of such data by packaging them as talking points that carry the patina of finished intelligence assessments. The credibility of such B-teamed intelligence can be bolstered further by stovepiping, funneling the data directly to policymakers, skirting peer review, institutionalized in the intelligence community. Stovepiping turns a competitive intelligence exercise into a Team B coup, something qualitatively different from an exchange of competing viewpoints, end quote. And so what I believe is happening now is something like this, but it's actually even more kind of sinister and disturbing, which seems to be that the U.S. intelligence community is being completely ignored, in part because of this mix of real and imagined like suspicion and animosity between Trump and the intelligence community in favor of a foreign intelligence agency, the Mossad, who,
Right.
you know, it's really important to understand that the Mossad is a hostile intelligence agency towards the United States, despite
That's
the
right.
fact that there is a kind of alliance between the U.S. and Israel. Mossad spies on the U.S. all the time. It is the reason that Israel has nukes right now is because they spied on our nuclear program and stole our nuclear secrets and built their own program off of the secrets they stole. And
Right.
for everyone who was, like, and I'm not completely dismissive of, the Russiagate narrative. Like, I do believe there were weird sort of shady connections between Trump's first, campaign and Russian intelligence. I would never completely dismiss that, although I do think it was overstated and ended up being like a terrible political rhetoric for the Democrats. People should be much more concerned about intelligence connections between Israeli intelligence and this administration, because they seem much stronger, much more pervasive, and they're directly affecting policy and creating these destabilizing policies. But all of that's to say, I really think this idea of the Team B intelligence coup is really kind of generative for understanding what's going on with the manipulation of intelligence right now.
Yeah, no, as you were reading through that, it reminded me almost of, the p-hacking scandals that are roiling a lot of, academic disciplines in the social sciences right now, and have been for several years now, because of the same exact thing. When you realize that you can cherry pick data, manipulate evidence, basically like ignore some inconvenient outliers that may actually be trends or be indicative of important exceptions to the trends that you're witnessing, that you can basically make an argument based on quote unquote data and intelligence or statistics or whatever for a predetermined outcome. And yeah, I think that's incredibly dangerous. I think it's, again, it's interesting to see the difference though between the kind of like stovepiped Team B intelligence that you were getting manipulated during the Iraq War era, and what might actually be a credible, what might actually, as more evidence comes to light, who knows? I'm now kind of speculating here about the role that the Mossad and other foreign intelligence agencies had in, the current strikes, or whether or not they maybe had something more to do with just Donald Trump witnessing what Israel was doing and wanting a piece of it, as some at least late breaking reporting is seeming to indicate at the time of this recording. Yeah, but either way, I mean, we're not basing any of this off of like real evidence, off of any real, and as Rubio even was so quickly to dismiss, the intelligence doesn't matter, right? We're going off of, the vibes based on what we are presuming about, even though, again, like all of the Iranian government's public rhetoric and actions have been to the contrary of war making and of, further escalation. They don't want this. It's clear that, I mean, I don't want to fall into the kind of logical fallacy of saying, well, even if they were enriching uranium, it's because it's a good deterrence. But I mean, I mean, there's a reason why our diplomatic relations with Iran are different from our diplomatic relations with North Korea, and why we're not talking about conducting strikes against North Korea. And it does, to some degree come down to the fact that, having a nuclear weapon is a good deterrence against, the aggression of an outsider or an outside entity like the US or Israel. To be clear, I'm not for nuclear proliferation here. I just want to make that absolute. Put that on the record in case I ever have to run for office one day.
No, I mean, who was it? Perlman and Ulbricht Steitek once said that, rhetoric is the alternative to force. Like we are, this is a rhetoric podcast. We are for the rhetoric, not the force.
That's right.
And that's precisely what the problem is in this case. Like we are using force based on nothing.
Yes.
They have nothing.
They have nothing.
They have no intelligence. They have the say-so of Netanyahu. That's the other thing. So
yes, as
you're saying, like Trump is watching a lot of Fox News, and that's influencing these decisions, but he also has a very close relationship with Netanyahu. And like, again, we talk so much about the dictatorial, exotic, like terrifying nature of these foreign leaders in places like Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Netanyahu is a deranged, warmongering, bloodthirsty foreign leader. Like, I don't know how you don't put him in that same category, if not in a category of his own. I mean, the bodies this man has stacked up in his 30 plus years in power in the Israeli government, it's like gobsmacking to behold.
No, he might actually be in prison right now
if he hadn't started this war, right?
Yeah,
I mean, these are like he has very clear political incentives to do these wars, which obviously bear more examination. But that's the other thing that, I understand that it can feel like we're going out on limbs here when we're talking about this hostile intelligence relationship between the Israeli intelligence and the U.S. But we know that, like, just like the U.S. does, Israeli intelligence has a sophisticated media strategy. So even if it is just Trump pumping Fox News directly into his brain, that is definitely influenced by Israeli intelligence. Israeli intelligence has regular guests appearing on Fox News.
Yes.
It's delivering talking points to Fox News. And so, like, that shouldn't be ignored either. The fact that media is very much shaped by intelligence. We saw that in the Iraq War in 2003 as well.
Yeah.
There were intelligence assets publishing news articles, in the pages of the New York Times and other major newspapers. Like, this stuff happens, and it's not tinfoil hat thinking, like, to bring it up, because I think that it highlights this issue of the lack of democratic accountability, even like setting aside again all of the problems we have with the secrecy of the intelligence agencies. I think it is better to have like debate internally and to actually like listen to those people, trust their expertise as a policymaker, than just to completely ignore it and believe what you want to believe based on nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it remains to be seen now whether or not that ignorance is truly at their peril. I mean, it sucks to have to go out on this note of, that, like, the not just, I mean, to say nothing of the American people, to say nothing of the Iranian people, of, people who are sheltering in Israel. Like, there are people who are going to bear much graver material consequences as a result of these very poorly informed decisions that, that again, you do just only have to wonder if a more rigorous sort of agonistic dissent in these kinds of communities would make a difference, would really, be able to forego some of these terrible consequences that are likely going to result from this.
I think it definitely would. Like, I think that, again, for all its flaws, I think the U.S. intelligence community is a bit more rational. Like it sees the writing on the wall when it comes to this U.S.-Israeli relationship, where that's why Obama was able to get them on board with the Iran deal in 2015.
Right.
They understood that it's better for the long-term stability of the American empire if it picks its battles,
Right.
and kind of like doesn't like invest in such a level of hawkishness that it destroys itself from the inside. And both Netanyahu and Trump, I think, are acting as like leaders who are out of options. They're desperate, they're reckless, and they're doing these things because they have no other buttons to push. And yeah, as you said, the terror of it is all of the innocent people who will be killed in the wake of these reckless decisions. I think in the end, they will backfire on both Trump and Netanyahu. But in the meantime, all of us suffer as a result. And that's what we need to fight back against.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. No, the message, I think, to conclude with really remains the same as what it was back in 2020. No war with Iran.
Yeah.
No war with Iran. You know, whatever can be done to, you know, as far as domestic expressions of dissent go, I think they cannot be loud enough right now, because we're at a really dangerous juncture where that dissent needs to be voiced.
Yeah. Voice it wherever and whenever you can. And to the Democrats, I would say, stand up to this, reclaim the Obama legacy. Like, he was your most popular president, you know, since what, Clinton, like, you know, like, and repudiate the Biden legacy. Like it's enough. Like that was a failed presidency. I'm glad he got us out of Afghanistan, but like the way forward is reclaim Obama and throw Biden away.
Yes. And don't use that fucking taco slogan anymore. Trump always chickens out.
We'll throw in a clip of that here at the end.
Chuck Schumer, saying Trump always taco Trump on Iran. Oh boy.
Taco Trump.
When it comes to negotiating with the terrorist government of Iran, Trump's all over the lot. One day he sounds tough, the next day he's backing off. And now, all of a sudden, we find out that Witkoff and Rubio are negotiating a secret side deal with Iran. What kind of bull is this? They're going to sound tough in public and then have a side deal that lets Iran get away with everything? That's outrageous. We need to make that side deal public. Any side deal should be before Congress and, most importantly, the American people. If Taco Trump is already folding, the American public should know about it. No side deals.
No, I mean, this is like, we have such massive problems in both parties, but at the end of the day, no war with Iran. That's the final message here. Alex, anything else to add?
No, just, you know, again, that still got to believe, in spite of all this, that there are brighter days to come, as long as we do maintain that spirit of dissent. And, you know, that's the best we can do right now. So keep voicing it, and we'll see where we go from here.
Solidarity with the people of Iran, and let's defeat this unjust war.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for tuning in, folks, and we will be back with you again soon. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Our show today was produced by Alex Helberg and Calvin Pollock, with editing work by Calvin and editorial assistance from Alex. Reverb's co-producers at large are Ben Williams, Sophie Wadzak, and Olivia Burnett. You can subscribe to Reverb and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Android, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out our website at www.reverbcast.com. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @ReverbCast. That's REVERB_CAST. If you've enjoyed our show and want to help amplify more of our public scholarship work, please consider leaving us a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice. And tell a friend about us. We sincerely appreciate the support of our listeners. Thanks so much for tuning in.